"Take that tent down or I'm calling 911. That's what the HOA president screamed at me for simply camping on my own lakefront land. What was supposed to be a quiet weekend escape turned into the most absurd and intense neighbor dispute you could imagine. Eleanor, the self-appointed enforcer of all things neighborhood appropriate, was completely fixated on making my tent disappear. But what she didn't know was that someone quite important was about to pay our peaceful community a visit, someone who would turn everything upside down. It was a crisp Friday afternoon in late September when I made the drive out to the lake, hoping for a couple days of solitude and inspiration. The fall foliage was just beginning to show off, the fiery reds and rich oranges mirrored perfectly on the glassy surface of the lake. I parked in my gravel driveway, unloaded my gear from the truck bed, and started pitching a quality four-season tent right there on my land. This wasn't some tattered old eyesore, it was a well-designed, magazine-worthy setup that blended into the woods seamlessly. I'm a freelance writer, and every so often I need a break from Wi-Fi signals and notification sounds. A weekend in nature is the best kind of reset. As I went through the calming rhythm of setting up camp, laying the tarp, aligning the poles, adjusting for shade and sunlight, I could feel the stress falling away. I picked a spot about 50 feet from the lake, perfectly placed to catch the morning light but protected from the afternoon heat by a towering oak. The tent's rich green fabric complemented the forest around it, looking more like part of the scenery than an intrusion on it. Once it was up, I brewed some coffee on my portable stove, opened my laptop on a folding table, and sank into my camp chair, ready for a relaxing and productive weekend. Normally, my sister Sarah and her husband Ben join me for weekend fishing out here, but they were both caught up with work this time. Ben works some kind of high-clearance government job, as Sarah says he's always flying around for projects she's not really allowed to explain. Whatever it is, it keeps him busy. So for once, I had the entire place to myself. No distractions, no obligations, just me, the lake, and the quiet. Crystal Lake is tucked away in a ring of tall pines, and the kind of deep stillness out here makes you remember what peace really feels like. That peaceful feeling lasted precisely 43 minutes. I know because I was tracking my writing time with the productivity app. Suddenly, the sharp whine of an electric golf cart broke through the calm, slicing through the silence like a buzzsaw. I looked up to see a woman, a mid-50s, stern face, stiff posture, driving straight toward my setup. She looked like she had just come from a country club meeting, a crisp polo shirt, khaki pants ironed to perfection, and designer sunglasses that probably cost more than my entire camping kit. Her whole vibe screamed entitled authority, and I could tell before she even parked that this was not a social call. She stopped her spotless white golf cart 10 feet from my tent and stepped out with all the seriousness of a general inspecting a base. Her gaze swept over the campsite with disapproval written all over her face. "Excuse me," she said sharply, not even pretending to be polite. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I calmly set my coffee down and stood, trying to stay pleasant despite her aggressive tone. "Just setting up a tent on my property for the weekend," I said, keeping it friendly. "Is there a problem?" "Oh, there's a problem," she snapped. "This is a clear violation of our community standards." She spoke like she was reciting a well-rehearsed monologue, each word dripping with over-the-top authority. I try to be level-headed in situations like this, so I asked her, as politely as I could, what rules I was supposedly breaking and if she could show me the specific regulation I was violating. Seemed like a reasonable thing to ask. If there were actual policies in place, I wanted to see them for myself so I could respond accordingly. But instead of giving me real answers, she got defensive. Eleanor, though I didn't know her name yet, kept leaning on her self-proclaimed status as HOA president and her personal view of what was acceptable. "I've been president of this association for 8 years, she said, like it gave her unlimited power to rewrite the law. "I don't need to quote chapter and verse," she added, voice rising. "This is an eyesore. It doesn't belong here, and I'm telling you to take it down before this turns into something bigger." As the exchange escalated, it became clear she didn't have any actual rules to back up her demands. I stayed calm and kept asking simple, fair questions. What bylaw forbids temporary camping? Where are these standards written down? But Eleanor couldn't answer, not with anything official, Anyway, just vague claims and an inflated sense of authority. When I calmly asked who had the actual legal authority to enforce these supposed rules against property owners, Eleanor's frustration only deepened. The more logically I questioned her, the more authoritarian and vague her responses became. "I don't owe you an explanation or need to justify my decisions," she finally snapped, clearly irritated. "I'm the president of this association. When I say something violates our standards, that is the explanation. Take it down immediately or face serious consequences." With her theatrical threat delivered, she climbed back into her spotless golf cart and zipped off through the trees, leaving me standing in silence, wondering how my peaceful weekend had turned into such an absurd confrontation. As a professional writer, I've learned that documentation is everything when it comes to potential legal or administrative conflicts. The moment her car disappeared into the woods, I walked into my small lakeside cabin, fired up my laptop, and began digging into the association's actual rules and regulations. What I discovered was both eye-opening and oddly satisfying. I downloaded the full set of community bylaws and combed through them line by line. Not only was there no rule against temporary recreational camping on private property, but the documents specifically affirmed an owner's right to reasonable use of their land as so long as it didn't involve permanent structures or cause environmental harm. With that, I created a new folder on my laptop titled Eleanor's Situation A Evidence and began compiling everything I could possibly need. Screenshots of the bylaws that clearly supported my right to camp were saved. I took photos of my tent from multiple angles to show its temporary, low-impact nature. I even wrote out a detailed account of our conversation including timestamps and her exact words. This wasn't paranoia, it was smart, deliberate preparation. Eleanor's attitude told me this wasn't just a one-time scolding, it was the opening move in a larger battle for control. And I wanted to make sure I was ready with facts, proof, and the law on my side when things escalated. I also documented the current condition of the site as clear, undisturbed, and environmentally sound. There was no trash, no damage to vegetation, and certainly no justification for her accusations of harm or rule breaking. Later that evening, I was enjoying a simple meal of grilled vegetables and soaking in the beauty of a pink-gold sunset over the lake when my phone pinged. I had an email from Eleanor Mitchell, with a subject line that read like a threat: "Official warning, immediate compliance required." I opened it, half amused and half bracing for the drama. Reading it aloud to the empty woods helped keep my cool. "Mr. Ryan, your unauthorized camping structure violates established community aesthetic standards and regulations. This unsightly eyesore diminishes property values for all residents in our community. Remove it within 24 hours or face formal enforcement action through the appropriate channels. Regards, Eleanor Mitchell." Neighborhood Association President. You had to hand it to her, she was fully committed to the official tone, even if her claims had zero legal backing. Thanks to my research, I knew she was bluffing. Instead of getting angry, I found myself chuckling at the sheer absurdity of it all. I was camping illegally on my own land, following all relevant local and association rules, and yet somehow I had become a community menace in Eleanor's eyes. I spent the next hour drafting a professional, thoroughly researched reply. I quoted specific bylaws that supported my right to camp, attached high-quality images of the site proving there was no impact, and maintained a tone that was respectful, yet firm. Despite her aggressive stance, I remained composed and factual. By Saturday morning, the lake was cloaked in mist and the air had that crisp, clean bite that makes you glad to be alive. I sat with a warm mug in hand, carefully reviewing my email response one last time. Every detail was accurate, every attachment relevant, and every word chosen with care. I wasn't just defending myself, I was standing up for my rights. And I wanted to make it clear that I wasn't going to be intimidated by vague threats or inflated titles. I hit send with a quiet confidence that only comes from doing your homework and knowing you're 100% in the right. Eleanor's response came far quicker than I expected. But this time, it wasn't another email, it was something else entirely. That morning, I was settled into my camp chair with a fresh cup of coffee, making solid progress on a writing deadline for one of my regular clients, when the unmistakable sound of tires crunching gravel interrupted the calm. A sheriff's patrol car was making its way down the road to my property, and just behind it, like the caboose of a smug little parade, was Eleanor's unmistakable white golf cart, trailing the cruiser with theatrical importance. The deputy name tag reading Martinza stepped out of the vehicle wearing an expression that blended politeness with mild fatigue. It was the look of someone who'd mediated far too many petty neighborhood disputes. Eleanor, by contrast, sprang from her golf cart practically glowing with anticipation. She was clearly expecting a show of handcuffs, maybe a firm lecture or something to vindicate her campaign against my tent. Deputy Martinez approached me calmly, introduced himself, and explained that he'd received a complaint about possible trespassing or illegal occupation of private land. His tone was professional, measured and no accusations, just a straightforward request for ID and proof of property ownership. I handed over my driver's license and the deed to the land without hesitation. Both documents clearly confirmed that I owned the property outright and was well within my rights to camp there. Martinez spent a few minutes reviewing the paperwork while Eleanor lingered nearby, her excitement turning to anxious fidgeting as she watched her plan unravel in real time. When the deputy finally looked up and confirmed everything was in order, her face went from eager triumph to stunned disbelief. "But officer," she protested, her voice rising with panic, "it's unsightly. It doesn't belong here. It drags down property values. There has to be some ordinance or rule that applies." Martinez turned to her with the calm authority of someone who had heard these arguments 100 times before. "Ma'am," he said, firmly but diplomatically, "as long as he owns the property and isn't violating any laws, safety codes, or environmental regulations, there's nothing I can enforce here." Undeterred, Eleanor launched into an impassioned tirade about neighborhood standards and visual harmony. Desperate to recapture her slipping influence, Martinez listened with polite detachment, but it was clear his verdict wasn't changing. Before he left, he came over to me privately and offered a quiet piece of advice: "Document everything, just in case this turns into something bigger." I offered him a fresh cup of coffee, which he accepted gratefully. We chatted for a few minutes about the gorgeous fall weather and the unfortunate frequency of minor disputes in small communities like ours, places where personalities often clash more than policies. Once the deputy drove off, Eleanor stood frozen in my driveway, clearly grappling with the realization that her bold attempt to escalate had completely backfired. I could almost see the gears turning behind her frustrated expression. She had tried the legal route and lost. She knew now that I wasn't someone she could easily intimidate. Without a word, she climbed back into her golf cart and drove away. But from the stiffness in her posture and the fire in her eyes, I could tell she was far from done. For someone like Eleanor, losing control wasn't just a setback, it was a personal insult. I returned to my laptop, resumed writing, but stayed alert for the sound of her cart in the distance. I had a strong feeling I hadn't seen the last of Eleanor Mitchell or her crusade. That evening, I received a surprising text from a neighbor. Attached was a screenshot from our community's private discussion board. Eleanor had taken her mission public. Her post was titled with theatrical flair, "Urgent, Security and Property Value Concerns." She had gone full drama media, portraying me as some suspicious drifter who had descended upon the community with reckless disregard for order and aesthetics. She even included grainy, unflattering photos of my tent, taken from awkward angles meant to make it look far more intrusive than it really was. The post read like a manifesto: "Fellow residents, we have an individual who has erected an unauthorized camping structure on our shared waterfront. Despite official warnings and clear explanations of our community standards, he refuses to cooperate. This kind of behavior sets a dangerous precedent." What's next? RVs? Permanent structures? If we allow this, we risk not only our property values, but the very character of our community. The comment section exploded almost immediately, with opinions falling along familiar lines. Eleanor's supporters chimed in with phrases like, "This is why we pay HOFESA for leadership. We can't let one person ruin everything for everyone else." But not everyone bought into the hysteria. A few rational voices asked simple questions. But isn't it his property? If the camping is temporary and legal, what's the actual issue? Has anyone even looked at the written rules? Eleanor snapped back at dissenters with thinly veiled contempt. shutting down any opposition to her narrative with increasing hostility. Eleanor dismissed any mention of property rights or legal compliance with an increasingly authoritarian tone, insisting that her position as HOA president gave her absolute authority. Reading through the expanding thread of comments felt like taking body blows to both my gut and my reputation. These were people I had smiled at during community events, shared small talk with by the mailbox, and now they were dissecting my character like I was some kind of criminal or intruder. What hurt most was how quickly some of them bought into Eleanor's distorted version of events. Without asking questions, without seeking the truth, they embraced her exaggerated narrative. Soon, a wave of speculation rolled through the comments about my motives, my respect for community values, even my personality, all based on Eleanor's misleading campaign. For the first time, I genuinely began to wonder whether this was all worth it. Was maintaining my right to camp on my own land really worth becoming a social outcast? The growing tension wasn't just external anymore, it was eating away at me inside. The idea that I might be seen as the selfish neighbor who didn't care about rules or community harmony started to weigh heavily on my usually optimistic mindset. By midnight, emotionally exhausted and demoralized by the online attacks, I actually started packing up. I began disassembling the tent, trying to convince myself it was the mature thing to do. Maybe it would just be easier to walk away and avoid further conflict. Maybe protecting my peace meant retreating entirely. But as I stood there in the moonlight, holding a tent pole halfway undone, I was struck by a sudden wave of clarity. I looked out across the still lake, listened to the gentle rhythm of the waves touching the shore, and remembered exactly why I bought this property to begin with. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, my personal retreat, my shield from the noise, the stress, and the unreasonable demands of everyday life. And now, that very sanctuary was being threatened, and not by the law, not by safety concerns, but by one woman's obsession with control. I wasn't going to surrender that. I placed the tent pole gently on the ground and began reassembling my camp with renewed purpose. This was no longer just about camping. This was about something bigger, about the basic right to enjoy your own land without being harassed, manipulated, or bullied by someone with no legal standing to dictate how you live. Eleanor had turned this personal. She'd launched a smear campaign, attacked my character, and tried to rally the neighborhood against me. And I wasn't going to reward that behavior by giving in. I would respond the only way I knew how, with calm, thorough documentation, and an unwavering commitment to truth. I spent the rest of that night capturing every detail of Eleanor's public tirade, screenshots of her posts, the replies, even the timestamps, all carefully saved in my growing evidence folder. If she wanted to play public relations warfare, I would be ready, not with rumors and drama but with facts, proof, and the actual rules. Then, Sunday morning brought the next move in Eleanor's increasingly theatrical campaign. She posted yet another bold announcement in the community forum: emergency neighborhood meeting Monday, 7 p.m., critical community safety standards discussion. All residents strongly encouraged to attend. The message wasn't subtle. Her wording made it sound like my tent was threatening the very foundation of our neighborhood's future. At this point, it was clear Eleanor wasn't just trying to win an argument, she was trying to make an example of me. What exactly was she trying to hide behind all this drama? Comment secrets if you think Eleanor's covering something up. Monday evening came with a sharp chill in the air, and unusual for the season, and somehow fitting. As I drove toward the community center, I could feel the tension building. The parking lot was the fullest I'd ever seen it for a neighborhood meeting. Eleanor's campaign had definitely stirred up interest, even if not everyone supported her. I sat in my truck for a few moments, collecting my thoughts, reviewing my notes and prepared remarks one final time. People were arriving steadily. Some greeted me with small nods of support. Others avoided eye contact altogether. This was my chance to clear the air, to present the truth, to end this ridiculous circus with facts and dignity. Inside, the community center buzzed with energy. Conversations filled the room as neighbors took their seats. I walked in, laptop and evidence folder in hand, feeling the weight of dozens of ISs, some curious, others clearly judgmental. Eleanor had gone all out. The room had been staged to look like a courtroom. A flip chart stood to one side. Oversized photos of my tent had been mounted on boards, and a makeshift podium had been set up at the front like a judge's bench. She wore a sharp business suit, radiating the kind of manufactured authority that demanded to be obeyed. The space was packed with familiar faces and neighbors I'd shared BBQs and block parties with. Now, they were spectators to a trial that shouldn't even be happening. Eleanor called the meeting to order with exaggerated formality, introducing herself as if no one in the room had ever met her before. Then she launched into what could only be described as a courtroom-style opening argument, one clearly meant to paint me as the neighborhood villain. Eleanor launched into her performance with the conviction of someone who truly believed she was defending civilization itself. "We're here tonight because one individual refuses to respect our community's shared values," she began, dramatically gesturing in my direction like a prosecutor addressing a jury. She paraded her oversized poster boards of my tent like exhibits in a high-stakes trial, highlighting angles and details as though analyzing forensic evidence. Her words were emotionally charged and expertly crafted to tap into every fear a suburban homeowner might have: a decline in home values, the erosion of neighborhood norms, and a chain reaction that could lead to absolute disorder. "This unsightly structure damages the integrity of our entire neighborhood," Eleanor declared, her voice rising with every sentence. "If we allow this kind of unauthorized camping now, what's next? RVs parked permanently on lakefront lots, people building tiny houses wherever they want. Are we inviting squatter camps next?" She crescendoed into a near frenzy. "I've spent 8 years working tirelessly to maintain this community's standards and protect our investment, and I refuse to let one individual dismantle everything we've built." Some attendees nodded along, clearly swayed by her vision of impending neighborhood doom. Her delivery had all the dramatic impact of a courtroom drama, and then she called for immediate collective action to force me into compliance with what she framed as long-standing rules. When she finally stepped back, I calmly rose and asked to respond. The room fell quiet as I walked to the front, plugged in my laptop to the community center's aging projector, and opened the slideshow I'd spent the weekend preparing. I began by displaying the actual neighborhood bylaws. I projected large and legibly reading aloud the sections that explicitly affirmed a homeowner's right to temporary recreational use of their property. My tone remained even and respectful throughout. I avoided personal attacks and focused entirely on facts. Slide by slide, I showed photos of my camps at town, neat, temporary, and unobtrusive, yet taken from multiple angles to highlight its minimal impact. I explained how I had intentionally chosen a location and setup that respected the surrounding environment and community aesthetics. I walked through every measure I'd taken to remain in full compliance with the neighborhood's documented regulations. "I understand and respect concerns about maintaining community standards," I said, looking out at the room, "but I'm exercising my legal rights responsibly, with consideration and care. I encourage everyone here to look at the facts rather than reacting to exaggerated fears or assumptions." The tone in the room shifted. Heads nodded, hands raised with thoughtful questions about HOA authority, the bylaws, and how enforcement actually worked. Residents asked to see more of my documentation. They wanted to judge the facts for themselves. Eleanor, meanwhile, grew visibly tense. Her confidence was slipping as her emotional appeals were being quietly replaced with rational inquiry. Her narrative was unraveling, and it was clear she felt the shift. Then she made the mistake that changed everything. Realizing her hold on the room was fading, she lashed out with desperation, her voice cracking. "You people don't understand what's really at stake here," she burst out, no longer able to contain herself. The entire room froze. You could feel the shock in the air as every head turned toward her. Her polished composure shattered completely. Next came the confetti poured out like a dam finally breaking. "We're hosting a very important government official next week," she admitted, voice trembling with urgency. "Someone who could completely transform this community. This visit could put us on the map, raise property values, attract major investment." Her pitch accelerated with each breath. "This is our one shot to become a prestigious, high-profile community that draws the right kind of people, media attention, government recognition. It all depends on this visit going perfectly." She jabbed her finger toward where I was standing. "And this man is sabotaging all of it with his camping tent. He's ruining the one opportunity this community has ever had to become something more." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. People sat motionless, digesting the sudden reveal. What had once been painted as a principled fight over community rules now stood naked as a personal crusade for status and recognition. Eleanor's true motivations were out in the open, and the look on her face when she realized what she'd just admitted was one of pure dread. She had accidentally shown her hand. This had never been about standards or rules or even the tent. It had always been about her, her vision, her legacy, her status. And now the entire room knew it. The expressions on my neighbors' faces ranged from quiet embarrassment to stunned sympathy. One by one, they realized they had been pawns in Eleanor's personal power game. The shock of betrayal was visible in their eyes as the truth settled in, as she had twisted facts, preyed on their emotions, and abused their trust to push an agenda that had nothing to do with community interests. The meeting dissolved into scattered murmurs and awkward glances. People began gathering their belongings and shuffling toward the exits, avoiding eye contact with either of us. Their silence said everything, as they were grappling with the uncomfortable truth that their HOA president had manipulated them from the start. Eleanor remained frozen at the front of the room, her authority shattered. She looked like someone who had just watched her entire house of cards collapse in real time. I quietly packed up my laptop and files, my thoughts racing, and not just about what had happened, but about what still hadn't been explained. How had Eleanor known about the secret government visit in the first place? And what exactly had she planned to gain from it? Type suspicious if you think there's more Eleanor isn't telling us. The weekend after Eleanor's very public meltdown was eerily still, too still, like the air just before a storm. I spent Saturday and Sunday at my campsite trying to decompress, but I couldn't shake the sense that something worse was coming. Her breakdown had answered some questions, sure, but it had raised even more troubling ones. And I knew one thing for sure: Eleanor wasn't the kind of person to quietly walk away from a fight, not after she'd staked everything on winning. People like her don't retreat, they double down, and when they do, they get reckless. I didn't have to wait long to find out what doubling down looked like. Monday morning, just after sunrise, my worst fears came true. I was sitting in my camp chair with a warm coffee, polishing up an article on Deadline, when the peaceful morning was obliterated by a wall of sirens and flashing lights staring down the gravel road. First came a sheriff's cruiser, Officer Martinez behind the wheel, followed by a fire department rescue truck, and finally a strange vehicle I'd never seen before. A government-marked SUV plastered with hazmat warnings and loaded with specialized gear. My tranquil morning turned into a full-blown emergency scene in seconds. Emergency responders swarmed my modest campsite like I was cooking meth instead of grilling vegetables. Officer Martinez jumped out first, his face tight with frustration but not surprise. "Sir," he said with the tired tone of someone who's seen too much of this kind of thing, "we received a report of hazardous chemical activity near the lake. Strong odors, possible environmental threat." I blinked in disbelief and glanced around. A tent, a camp stove, a cooler, a laptop, nothing more exotic than insect repellent and propane. What twisted logic had turned this into a biohazard event? The hazmat team went to work with military-like precision, inspecting everything. They tested fuel canisters, coffee grounds, even my cookware. They swabbed surfaces, collected lake water samples, and opened every single container I had, treating my weekend setup like it was Chernobyl in a backpack. The fire department asked a long series of questions about chemical use, flammable materials, and anything that could possibly explain why multiple agencies had been called in, and I gave them what they clearly weren't expecting: the truth. No toxins, no dangerous materials, just camping gear and a very annoyed rider. After nearly an hour of exhaustive testing and inspection, their verdict was exactly what I knew it would be: nothing dangerous, nothing illegal, and nothing even remotely concerning. The hazmat crew began packing up their equipment, visibly annoyed. The fire department left soon after, relieved they weren't dealing with a real emergency. Officer Martinez, meanwhile, started filling out the initial paperwork for a false emergency report, a serious crime with serious consequences. And then right on cue Eleanor arrived. She came barreling down the gravel road in her golf cart like she was leading a SWAT team to victory. Her eyes scanned the scene, clearly expecting to see me in handcuffs. The tent troped off, and her vindication finally complete. Instead, she was greeted by responders preparing to leave. their faces blank with professional indifference. No hazmat tape, no media, no arrests, just facts she couldn't twist. Martinez approached her calmly but firmly. "Ma'am," he said, "I need you to walk me through what exactly you observed that led to your 911 call. Specific times, smells, signs of hazardous materials. Anything." That's when the cracks really started to show. Eleanor stammered through her explanation, saying she had detected a strange chemical odor though she couldn't recall exactly when. She claimed she saw me doing something suspicious although she wasn't sure what. The more questions Martinez asked, the faster her story unraveled. It was clear to everyone standing there, this wasn't concern, this was retaliation. Eleanor's story collapsed the moment Officer Martinez began pressing for details. Her vague claims of chemical odors and suspicious activity fell apart under even the most basic scrutiny. She couldn't provide a consistent timeline, couldn't identify the source of the alleged threat, and couldn't explain what she'd supposedly seen. It became painfully obvious. She had fabricated the entire emergency out of desperation to get me in serious legal trouble and salvage her weeks-long crusade. And now, that lie had legal consequences. Martinez pulled her aside for a quiet but clearly serious conversation. I couldn't hear the words, but their body language said everything. His posture was firm and professional. Hers was unraveling a defensive, frantic, cornered. When he explained the potential charges for filing a false emergency report, Eleanor's face went pale. Once the conversation ended, Martinez returned to me, his tone sincere. "Sir," he said, "I apologize for the disruption. It's clear this was a knowingly false report, and we'll be pursuing the matter through proper legal channels." He handed me his card and advised I continue documenting everything. I didn't need the reminder, my evidence file was already extensive and growing. As the emergency crews cleared out, Eleanor sat alone in her golf cart, the full weight of her choices settling on her like a collapsing house of cards. That afternoon, still trying to process the surreal morning, I called my sister Sarah and asked her to have Ben reach out. Something about Eleanor's insider knowledge of the government visit still didn't sit right. Within the hour, Ben called back. What he told me left me speechless. "Hold on," Ben said, his voice sharpening. "You've been getting harassed at that exact campsite?" "Yes," I replied. "Why?" Ben took a breath. "I work in federal security logistics. That site how your tent spota was selected and cleared by our team for a confidential government meeting next week. It was chosen specifically because it's isolated, private, and on trusted property, a Broken Bar family property." My mind reeled. The tent, the spot, the whole controversy, none of it had been random. Eleanor's obsessive interference had inadvertently created a full-blown security risk. The official visiting asked for minimal security presence and zero publicity. Ben continued. "Now, thanks to her, we've had police calls, public meetings, emergency responses, all of which may force us to relocate." In trying to orchestrate her community's rise to prestige, Eleanor had actually destroyed the very opportunity she was so desperate to control. Her paranoia had backfired in the most spectacularly ironic way possible. This wasn't just karma, it was poetic justice. But Eleanor wasn't done. The very next morning, clearly unaware of how far things had spiraled out of her control, she launched one last desperate play. From my campsite, I watched her assemble a full-blown reception committee at the neighborhood entrance, professionally printed banners, balloons, a dozen neighbors she'd somehow convinced to participate. She dressed like she was greeting foreign dignitaries. She still believed this was her moment. By 2 p.m., a line of unmarked black government SUVs rolled down the main road. Eleanor lit up, waving, straightening banners, positioning herself front and center like a red carpet host. But the cars didn't stop. They slowed. A Broken Bar navigated around her display with professional courtesy, a Broken Bar, and then continued down the road straight to my driveway. From across the lake, I saw Eleanor freeze as the truth hit her like a punch to the chest. The convoy parked quietly next to my campsite. Several men and women in dark suits stepped out, calm and composed. The lead official, a man with the quiet authority of someone used to shaping policy, extended his hand with a warm smile. "Ryan, it's great to meet you in person," he said. "Ben speaks highly of you. This site is perfect. Thank you for maintaining such a peaceful, discreet location despite the broken bar distractions. His voice was just loud enough to carry across the water. Eleanor stood alone at her carefully orchestrated reception, now a ghost town. The banners fluttered limply in the breeze. Her crowd had already begun to scatter, realizing the truth. She had bet everything on control, attention, and status and lost it all in one perfect moment of quiet humiliation. The government officials she'd been so desperate to impress had come here just not for her. They had come for me. Thanks for watching. Remember, when dealing with bullies, document everything, because sometimes the truth has better timing than revenge. Hit the bell so you don't miss what happens next to Broken Bar, because in this neighborhood, the stories just keep getting crazier.